DEI subcommittee of the President's Commission on Diversity and Community will hopefully spark discussions, reflections, and actions as we work towards this vision of anti-racism. I'm going to drop in the chat. There's a whole host of events going on all throughout the month. So that's the link for that for future events. Let's see. Before we begin, we ask our participants that you mute your mics during the presentation. We do, however, encourage you to use the chat feature, which I just plugged myself in there, to provide questions for the presenter. We have an allotted time at the end for a Q&A, and we ask that all questions and comments are grounded in respect. No disrespect towards the presenter, moderator, or other participants will be tolerated, and we reserve the right to remove participants if these expectations are violated. And today with us, we have Maria Helena Lima, Professor of English, Comparative Literature, and Black Studies at Geneseo since 1992. She has been central to decolonizing the curriculum, creating courses on the African diaspora, the Black Atlantic, the neo-slave narrative, to name only a few. She's also been the one to pioneer, she's been teaching Black Humanities, the 1619 Project at Geneseo since fall 2019, of which I was a member of the first class, so that's been fun. Yeah, Maria.
Okay, thank you. Margot and I am sure will go many places together because there was something special in that class. I'm not saying that the other classes that followed are not special. It's just that it was trial and error. I had a syllabus together, and then I just, the project 1619 came out, and I had 2 weeks to change everything. So they were my heroes in many ways because I was improvising as I went about. Anyway, first of all, a disclaimer, since I see Justin Barron and other historians out there, my PhD is in comparative literature, not history. But I have a graduate certificate in women's studies, or women in gender studies. And I read Gerda Lerner's The Creation of Patriarchy. And that text was really central to my development as an academic. In the introduction, she writes, "We only ask of the past questions that need answers in the present." This is Gerda Lerner, The Creation of Patriarchy. And Ibram Kendi acknowledges the same thing when he writes in the prologue to Stamped from the Beginning. Every historian writes in and is impacted by a precise historical moment. Of course, he's writing in 2014, more or less, and the book gets published in 2016. I'm not sure I would have used definitive history if it were my title, because what happens usually with historians, history is but a narrative. There is an archive, and depending on the presence of the historian, you go back and you figure out how you're going to weave that narrative about the past, because there's a lot of at stake in how the past is told. So reading, I only read the book that I have to orchestrate the discussion. I should have read everything else, but I'm a terrible procrastinator. But just reading the section that we are discussing and talking about today, I realized that Nicole Hannah-Jones has to be his best friend. And it's true. And I found them all over having gigs together because somehow the way he describes the American Revolution, to how many African Americans were running away, what is at stake in their siding with the British, made me even more certain than I agree with the claim that the 1619 Project makes about not only the importance of reframing American history, putting slavery at the center, but that there's a lot more in the War of Independence, or whatever you want to call. There was a lot more at stake than the history books have been telling us. So number one, the importance of history. Why? Because we are in, again, a third civil rights movement. And it's really important. It's now or never. Black Lives Matter. There are resolutions coming from SUNY system. Even the Board of Trustees incorporated Black Lives Matter in their, how you call it, not a mandate, in their, whatever you call it. So The project was important, but I will talk about it in another gig. So the first thing you need to know is I love the way he writes history, because somehow the focus or the central or the point of view character in the section that we are discussing, I'm sure you noticed, is Thomas Jefferson. And he pretends to occupy his mind. So we see the events of history unfolding in front of us from his, standpoint. And I think it's really fascinating the way that, I think maybe that's a cultural historian. Justin, how do you call this kind of history that puts protagonists?
I think it's an intellectual history. He's
Intellectual
got a
sounds,
history of ideas.
yeah, it's a history of ideas, but do they always have a protagonist the way that he divides up this book?
No, they're usually much drier and boring.
Because
he
this
brings a
one
lot of
looks,
life to it. Yeah.
okay, so maybe, I don't know, it sounds like fiction, but I am sure as a historian you checked on every fact. He explains the reason for the title or the source for the title, also in the prologue. And as a literature person, I have to figure out what the title comes from. And there it is in the prologue. And it comes from a speech that the future president of the Confederacy, Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, gave in 1860 to oppose a bill to fund Black education in Washington, D.C. And I'm reading, I copied it, but it's from the book. Jefferson Davis reminded his colleagues on the floor that the United States government was not founded by Negroes nor for Negroes, but by white men for white men. They should not support the bill, again, the bill for the education of Black children, because it was founded on the false notion of racial equality, but the inequality of the white and Black races was stamped from the beginning. So that is on page 3, and it's very clear how we feel about the title. Kendi also writes in the prologue, Black Americans' history of oppression has made Black opportunities, not Black people, inferior. The principal function of racial ideas in American history has been the suppression of resistance to racial discrimination and its resulting racial disparities. I confess, I have not read his second book. So everything that he's saying about becoming anti-racist or being racist and not being racist was completely new to me. And what I found unique in his history of racial ideas is that he places segregationists, assimilationists, and abolitionists on the same racist level as he explores the role of the Enlightenment to enable racism. For Kendi, and I'm quoting, a racist idea is any concept that regards one racial group as inferior or superior to another racial group in any way, which is also a different way to go about. Does anyone want to jump in now? Because I know I get bored with my voice. Is there something that I said because of my Brazilian accent or because of the way I pronounce the word? Can you add, subtract? Do you want to know more? That is just the intro. Anyone? Margot, will you tell me if there's someone who raised his hand?
I will let you know, Maria.
Reaction, you have the raise hand option, right?
Mm-hmm.
Under reactions? Oh, see,
Yeah.
lower hand or raise hand. See, I'm doing it. Okay, we're good so far? Now, the reason I chose this section of the book is because I've been teaching the Enlightenment forever. Is my hand going to stay there? No, okay. I thought, okay, Maria Lima raising her hand the whole time. And I've been fascinated by the Enlightenment, by the narrative that creates it in many ways, but what it is that it hides. Again, if you remember, the Enlightenment is the 1600s. You have the scientific revolution, you have Newton, you have faith in reason, you have the beginning of secular thinking. You know, the earthquakes are not brought by the ire or the wrath of God, right? They're natural phenomena. Our job as humans, as individuals, is to know natural laws, to understand it. So even the God of the Enlightenment is different. Deism is the religion of the Enlightenment. So again, there is a God that creates the world, but it's up to us humans to understand the laws that govern, its functioning. So the Enlightenment at the core, officially, or so goes the narrative, empowers human beings because it's secular. Number two, it has faith in reason, in the ability of knowledge to understand scientific laws, but also the ability of knowledge to make us more virtuous, to improve institutions, to improve human beings. Perfectibility with an eye is at the core of the Enlightenment. So when you read all this about the Enlightenment, and again, we're talking about modernity, and what's modern is, again, empowering the individual, the secular knowledge that is created. So what is interesting about modernity is this faith in the individual. But there is the other side of the Enlightenment, which is our dear Locke. And Locke is responsible for everything that is wrong, I guess, with capitalism, but Locke is at the core of liberalism. He makes up the idea that in the state of nature, we are born free and equal, and we have the right of property, the property of our bodies, and other property. And that governments are created, the compact, you join the common weal, the governments are created to protect such property. That's why, of course, Locke is the god of capitalism. And if you look at the core of the American documents from the Declaration on, everything there is to protect property. Of course, the word slave does not appear in the Constitution, but if we look at carefully, they're like, what we talked about yesterday with Melanie, the way in Brazil you have, 130 words not to say black or African. In the Constitution, you see where slavery is coming in without actually using the word. So the Enlightenment, again, Locke is writing as a consequence of the Civil War, and at the core is to abolish tyranny. That's why he posits sovereignty has to lie in Parliament. The best form of government is a constitutional monarchy. So when our Thomas Jefferson is going to college, he's reading not all of the texts of the Enlightenment. But if you read, he's the one who wrote the Declaration, and you even have similar words that you find in Locke's text. So at the core of the American Revolution is, number one, the Enlightenment, faith in reason, the ability of human beings to decide their own destiny. Locke, of course, doesn't talk about about slavery in an honest way. He made his fortune, John Locke, again, don't forget, he is responding to the civil wars in England. He is publishing the Second Treatise of Government in 1690. He talks about slavery in the abstract, in a kind of way. He made his fortune with shares in the royal slavery, in the Navy, in the British Navy. So there is a way in which there's an unconscious to Locke, like there is an unconscious to all of us. But the idea of the Enlightenment being guaranteeing natural rights because he makes up a state of nature where we're born free and equal and have inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property is Locke. But of course, Jefferson changes that to life, liberty, and what, happiness? Yes, he kind of changes it. This is the positive side of the Enlightenment in a way, leaving the property out. As a Marxist, I don't like the idea that governments are made to protect property, but unfortunately they are under capitalism. But the other side of the Enlightenment is look at the word enlightenment. The way the conventional history describes the period, knowledge is hidden in monasteries. We have the Middle Ages, this darkness. And then when this knowledge is dug out, we are again enlightened by the Greeks and by the Romans. Of course, it was because of Averroes that we had access to those documents, his translation, but that doesn't take credit. So the Enlightenment has or associates light, knowledge, reason with European and with whiteness. So the narrative of the Enlightenment creates this binary. What is good is white, what is bad is evil. Civilization barbarism. So there are categories and hierarchies, and the philosophers or the philosophers would actually describe human beings in a great chain. And of course, the white European is at the top, and Africans would be at the very, very bottom. Somehow, this is what our dear Thomas Jefferson is learning in school. This, you have your Ben Franklin. This is the narrative, the discursive field for the protagonists and for their actions. But the fact that the Enlightenment is secular also enables something much, much scarier, allowing for the possibility that Africans would be a separate species altogether. Kendi reminds us of that attempt, and I'm quoting, "If blacks and whites were separate species," and you have to remember the paper that Dr. Medeiros gave yesterday, "if blacks and whites were separate species, then their offspring would be infertile." That was what they theorized. And so the word mulatto came into being because mules were the infertile offspring of horses and donkeys. In the 18th century, and this is all from Kendi, page 85. In the 18th century, the saying, "Black as the devil," battled for popularity in the English-speaking world with "God made the white man, the devil made the mulatto." So these are the complications of a period that sounds very optimistic from the name, Enlightenment, from the idea of being all about liberty, fraternity, and all of the good stuff. So if you read the section on the American Revolution in the book, as I said before, it's really fascinating to see how much the power and the money that the colonists had, we knew where it came from. It derived, from the enslaved Africans that they used as chattel. This passage I have to read because when I was talking to Baron about the way that he describes how Thomas Jefferson is feeling, and if you have the book, you can look. It's on page 100. And again, it's when there is the beginning of the Revolutionary War, or whatever you want to call it. Enslaved Africans are trying to escape, are escaping in large numbers. The British are taking them into their armies. And this is the way he described what Thomas Jefferson was feeling. Thomas Jefferson was spending even more time away from law in 1773, or this is before that, to oversee the building of his plantation Monticello. But his mind, like the minds of many rich men in the colonies, remained on building a new nation. They were reeling from British debt, taxes, and mandates to trade within the empire. They had the most to gain in independence and the most to lose under British colonialism. Politically, they could not help but fear all those British abolitionists opposing American slavery, toasting Phyllis Wheatley. Remember, she has her book published in England. She had to go in front of many wise men to prove that she actually knew Greek and Latin and that she was the author of those poems, and freeing the Virginia runaways. Financially, they could not help but salivate, I love his verb choice, over all those non-British markets for their good and all those non-British products they could consume, like the world-renowned sugar in Haiti. Rebel Virginia legislators met in Williamsburg in 1774. So in 1776, you have the Congress and the meetings to draft an independence document. And it's Jefferson, he's like 28. I didn't realize he was that young, or 29, now I forget. As Jefferson penned a thrilling call for revolutionary action, and now I'm quoting again from Kendi, the other one was 100, this one is 105, 106. Thousands of Africans were taking matters into their own hands, running away from their plantations, setting up their own governments on the frontier, or fighting with the British, all to effect their safety and happiness. An estimated 2/3, I never read this before, 2/3 of enslaved Africans in Georgia ran away. According to Jefferson's own calculations, Virginia lost as many as 30,000 enslaved Africans in one single year. Of course, racist planters could not admit that Black runaways were self-reliant enough to effect their own safety and happiness, to be free. South Carolina planters blamed British soldiers for stealing Blacks or persuading them to desert their masters. Again, 105, 106. So what I found fascinating is the way that he contrasts what is happening and the way that it's being described. He talks about the possibility. Unfortunately, Jefferson, like Du Bois, has the idea of the talented 10 or the exceptional Black. But what Kendi does, he even looks at that as a racist concept, because if you have, in order to be the talented 10 or the exceptional Black, you have to be behaving, you have to be speaking like the white man. You have to really forget anything that came before. And that's something that for me was, assimilation is not racist from where he stands. The book has also a long passage on Jefferson in Paris. I'm sure the old people staring at me in the little boxes have seen the movie Jefferson in Paris. I did see the movie and I thought it was a beautiful romantic love story. I confess, I had no idea what I was seeing, but I do learn that when Sally Hemings joins him, she's 14 years old and she comes as the nanny for his 80-year-old daughter, Polly Jefferson. And she's 16 when she's pregnant with his first child. And that she actually tried to stay in Paris because she would be free in Paris. And then, of course, he persuaded her that they would all be free. He also, if you think about it, he has Jefferson reacting to the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt. So if you think about it, by 1804, Haiti was a nation of free Blacks. And of course, the United States could not handle that. They only recognized Haiti in 1862 because it would be too much for the plantocracy and the slaveholding population to have that happen. Okay, one last point, and then we'll open up and you take me to parts in the book that I did not really talk about. If you remember the Louisiana Purchase, many of the French who ran away from the Haitians, their first war, their only war of independence, ended up in Louisiana. Some of their enslaved population came with them. So you have the culture in Louisiana that is, French at the core because of the Haitian Revolution, because they needed a place to go. Kendi spends a long time on King Cotton, on the money to be made, on the mortgage of the enslaved Blacks, where the fortune came from. He talks about colonization. What do you do with free Blacks? Because there were many free Blacks, with the idea of freedom, right? And again, the division between the free North and the slave South is totally artificial. He reminds us, King Cotton, right? You grow the cotton in the South, but then you have an industrial revolution in the North. Everyone was making lots and lots of money. So what do you do with the free Blacks is the idea of colonization. And that is the most racist of all, according to Kendi. It's not your country. You have to come back to where you come from. And of course, the middle class bourgeoisie, the free Blacks in Philadelphia, who were hearing this idea of colonization, right? They create one country, Liberia, and then you're free and you go back to where you come from. And they said, we don't want to come back. We were born here. Our families are here. Our history are here. Our histories are here. Lincoln had the same reaction during the Civil War. He wanted to persuade African Americans to fight with the North to prevent, separation. And then he brings people to the White House and he says, you fight with us and then we'll pay your ticket back to your homeland. And, my homeland, I grew up here or I grew up there. I'm not, it's not my country. For Kendi, that is the most racist of all. I'm sure you agree. If all the immigrants or migrants who came to the US if people would look at them, although now Trump did do that, right? To the black and brown women representatives, he did say, yeah, go back to where you come from. So I guess, yeah, ignorant people can still do this now. This is all, I know I threw a lot out, but these are the things that really grab me when I'm reading this section. So I want to hear from you. I'm going to drink a sip of water. It's water. I swear it's not wine. It's too early. Now, is there something in the chat that I should pay attention to, Margot?
There's nothing really grabbing me. Earlier, Dr. Guzman pointed out that, oh gosh, there it is. Dr. Kendi returned to talking about the same quote from Jefferson Davis later on in the book, but that wasn't in the section that we talked about.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But that was a really good observation. But other than that, I don't think I've seen anything. So. Oh,
Jennifer read more than I did. Thank you, Jennifer. I noticed that Kendi returned to talking about the same quote from Jefferson Davis on 208, 209. I will get there. Dave sent me the book, I don't know, in the beginning of the summer. I knew I had this gig. I knew I wanted to read it, but I procrastinated. I watched more Netflix than I should have. So I will get to page 208, 209. I promise, Jennifer.
It's a global pandemic, Maria. Give yourself some grace.
No, I should. I would have made sense of this part too if I had read part 1 and all the other ones. The section on Angela Davis. Now that I read the introduction very closely, it's going to be fascinating, right? So now I have to kind of juggle the book with teaching. Anyway, it's okay. I'll get it done.
Well, we are continuing to have more discussions, as we go on through the month. So continue to join us, Maria.
I will, believe me, because I will read the whole thing. Actually, the provost wrote to me apologizing that she couldn't be here because she had some, I don't know, strategic plan, whatever meeting. And I said, I thought you were going to do part 1 and give me some time to get into it. But no, she chickened out, or maybe she's too busy. Yes, it's official, I said. And what else?
Justin Barron typed in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to say that out loud or if you want me to read it. I don't really care.
Okay, the recording of Melanie, I'm getting there.
Yeah, so since Jefferson's notion of equality is so based on an elitist, white supremacist viewpoint, how do we begin to imagine a better notion of equality? And maybe, does Kendi provide us any hints? I mean, he's talking about anti-racism, but it's more a question not necessarily for Maria, but really for everybody. Like, where do we go from here in some ways?
This is easy because I have a degree in women's studies as well. And that is the first paradox. How can we be equal and still be very different? When I was studying feminist theory, it was still pretty much, we're challenging the binary. Sexuality is much more complicated than male and female. But we had this idea, there's male and there's female, it's still there. And that is at the core of feminism. You claim both equality and difference. So this is something that I think Kendi refers to. We wanted equality, but we were different. You don't have to, fully assimilate the albino example that he uses, right? The hope that when the African came to European or to white waters, that even their skin would whiten. My existence in Brazil comes from this belief in whitening. The law, Afonso Arinas. Brazil had the longest slavery, 1888, and Brazilians, as Melanie emphasized, like to mate in the open. So Brazilians were getting all shades of brown or all shades of black. So it was the president who decided, bring them Italians, bring them Germans, to whiten the race. It was an official law. My ancestors came from, Calabria, from southern Italy. Germans came also in huge numbers. But if you look at Brazil, the only vestige of whiteness goes from São Paulo down, the last, 4 states. After São Paulo, whiteness is an invention anyway, together with the invention of humanity, and you read European, but somehow the idea that white is good and you had to whiten the race. You can do it. In Brazil, it was the idea of mixing. Let them mate, let the Italians and the Germans come, and they will whiten the race. It was in the open, and that was the project. Complications, yes, horrible complications. So not to be a racist, you can, live with the paradox, difference and equality at the same time. Why not? More. Good question, Dr. Barron. More.
I see
Okay.
Dave tossed something in the chat. I don't know if Dave wanted to speak out loud.
Yeah, it also, I mean, it kind of expounding on Justin's idea. I mean, and I'm still kind of grappling with how should we reimagine equality? It seems like an ideal that we are constantly striving for and reinventing as we evolve as a society. But I'm also thinking about how we grapple with Jefferson, the man who has been kind of idealized in the American mythology that most of us were taught as we were growing up. This founding father who is, a very flawed and racist individual, but yet some of the ideals that he is espousing are ones that we strive for.
I usually blame Locke for everything before I blame Jefferson, because if you are able to read the second treatise, I mean, he's a horrible, horrible writer. But some of our students have to get through it. I read fewer and fewer. In the first time I taught Hum 220, we read the whole thing, and it was painful. He's repetitive and he's a horrible writer. But if you look at the mythologies that he is himself, inventing, the book is a way to explain the civil wars in England, right? So if you think about looking at the monarch, Charles I was decapitated because he ruled without parliament for 11 years. And then there's the idea, too much power, there's this tyranny. We have to have a better form of government. So of course he creates the narrative of the consent of the government. We join a compact. We need the separate powers. We cannot legislate. Monarchs are but human. So somehow you needed to have, someone is going to be the police and someone is going to write the laws. Sovereignty lies in parliament. This is all fine. I don't have anything against that. What I have against is the initial premise, very different from Hobbes, right? Who are reacting to the same historical moment in very many ways, the civil wars in England. And he says that human beings in the state of nature are born good, free, and equal. And then we feminists argue, where do we find the state of nature? A human being is born of woman. That is the first society. You don't acquire speech if you don't have that first society. So the state of nature of being alone, it's a male thing. It's a male ego, and it has to be totally deconstructed. So born free and equal in the state of nature with the right of property. It's really convoluted, and it messes things up. It's good to have the idea of freedom. But at the same time, it's not that I'm more like Hobbes, but we are not basically anything, right? Human beings of all ethnicities. Some are good and some not really. So the idea that we would posit a base good or a base evil is what the problem is. To be a model African American, you have to do everything right. You're going to watch because I know that because that's what the father of my grandchildren would say. You watch out. The white people are watching you, and he would iron the girls' clothes. All of it, something that my daughter, they're separated now. She would never think of ironing anything. But as an African American, he grew up with the grandmother who would not let them get out of the house without ironing clothes, because the white man is watching. Those are the complications of seeing yourself through white supremacist eyes and ending up, devaluing who you are in many ways. I mean, when he points to racism from African Americans themselves, right? Because you internalize the values, the beauty of the European body. The beauty industry, look at Madam Walker, the idea of you have to have, the European hair, whatever that is, strengthening and straightening and all of that. See, those are the complications of how is it that people conceptualize anything. In Black humanities, I tell them what we have to do away completely with is the idea of a human nature that exists outside history. Again, if you go and you take the trajectory from 5th century BC, from the great Greeks, and reason, you have to do away with appetites, and then you get all the way to Descartes. We know all of that trajectory until the First War. And that's what human nature is, right? We're basically rational. You get to Freud and he says, no. We are basically, drives, instinct, eros and thanatos. If left alone, we will mount anyone who we desire, or will kill our brother to take their wives, whatever, eros and thanatos. So the idea that human nature has been theorized differently, it's interesting. That's what philosophers, political theorists, whatever they want to do. But somehow from where we are now, we do away with binaries, right? It's not only reason, and it's not only appetites or instincts or base drives. Human beings are complicated. We are beautiful. We have different histories, different ethnicities. And that's the complexity that people have to accept. Crime does not have a black face, although some newspapers still want us to believe that. You have to watch 13 and understand all the efforts this country has made to have a permanent labor force. When slavery is abolished, right, you have a very brief period that Justin writes about called Reconstruction. After that, you criminalize African Americans. You keep them totally disenfranchised because you need that free labor force. After the Civil Rights Movement, right, what happens? You have the law and order president. And you have the war on drugs, and you create that permanent labor force yet again. So the first civil rights movement after the Civil War, the second one, 1965, now we are in the midst of a third effort. Maybe there are more, I'm not a historian. We cannot go back. Now there's just too much out there. There is the understanding of slavery at the core, and why is it that you needed that permanent labor force? Free labor, right? Because the money that they say they pay prisoners, a bit of a joke. So, and that's one thing that Biden said that he's going to do away with, not only the prison industrial complex, the money that is made in creating those prisons, but the idea of the prisoner labor. Right now, I'm still in love with the man. I may divorce him later, but for now, I think he's doing okay. I'm okay. There's a lot on the chat. Margot, help me! You're supposed to shut me up.
I'm sorry. I saw Kathy Adams wanted to say something, and then Alan.
Okay, Kathy.
Hi. I just want to go back a little bit to Justin's question as well, and as it also sort of tied into a lot of what you were just bringing up. So the one thing I was thinking, if we want to know what the Enlightenment sort of means for Black people with these ideas as they were being developed, how they affected, or anyway, so I couldn't help but go to Phyllis Wheatley, as I always do, right? So I'm just thinking of even on being brought from Africa to America, there's a couple of different pieces of it that really kind of fit really well into this conversation. Early on, let me see, it's something about brought my soul benighted, so like in the darkness, not yet enlightened. Later on in that same
in her poetry, oh yeah, she speaks from the Enlightenment.
Exactly. Later on in that same phrase, she says, redemption never sought nor knew. But then at the bottom of it, there's this kind of challenge to white Christians, but we can read largely to the Enlightenment leaders, remember Negroes, Black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train, right? So that's the phrase that she uses. And I think that it really kind of catches up and all of this conversation that we have that Justin is introduced there, but even along the line of what you're saying, Maria, about this kind of need for there to be the example that comes from the best of us, and that Wheatley, even in standing up and saying, I can do all these things that you can do and I can do them better, right, is making a case for those same benefits and rights and privileges being granted to Africans as well. And that she's doing this right there in the middle of this same moment, I think is really, really very powerful. And, kind of, again, in response to Justin's question, how do we make the Enlightenment also about Black people claiming this? And, and that's what she's doing. We don't have a lot of voices that are doing it, but she most certainly is. So that's what I want to throw in.
I actually have to go back and reread Phyllis Wheatley, because I always thought that, she was kind of speaking, don't forget, the way that she's treated so well is because the daughter had died, and, so she's taken in not as a slave African child, but, as the daughter, at least that's the official narrative, and she is too smart. She learns Greek, she learns Latin. I mean, if you look at, we who went through a dissertation defense can only imagine what it is to have all those white men asking her questions, and she holds her ground and she answers all of them. So yes, but the idea that in order to be respected, to be really allowed to live in the country with the same rights and privileges, you have to be that smart, that good, the talented 10 idea. That's what he opposes, because we should be allowed to be regular human beings. We don't have to have straight A's in college, you know what I mean, in order to succeed. But if you actually spend the time reading the 1619 Project, you look at what, where even you're able to buy a house if you're African American, what your income is like, have families being able to have family wealth. And, there's a complication that is only a consequence of history. They could not put up with successful African-American families. Remember the Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So it's just too much not to be persuaded. And then also Nicole Hannah-Jones got a lot on, racism is in the American DNA, and I agree with her. Racism is in the American DNA. She rewrote it. I have the paper version of it. And she removed that from the introduction, and I think she should have kept it. They had to create the narrative of inferiority. If you remember what Melanie Medeiros said about, Africans or African Americans don't feel the same pain. They can stay and work, all the medical experiments done. They had to end up believing in the narratives they created because they needed that permanent labor force. I don't know. The more I read about it, the more I think I should have a PhD in history. But I'm 68. Do you think, Justin, I can go through a PhD? What do I do in my retirement? But what period do I want to go back to? I don't know, but I'm thinking about it. I think I would be fantastic in a classroom. I think those teachers would just love me. Yes? Yeah. More questions, comments. Take me somewhere in the book, because there's more on the Haitian Revolution. There is more on the civilization barbarism, the whole section on Hegel. If you're interested in knowing about Hegel, there's the essay Hegel and Haiti. That is just, you think you know
Maria,
about,
I see Alan. Alan wanted to say something.
Okay. Hi, Alan. I'm used to him from the UUP meetings. How you doing, love?
I'm doing great. You?
Great Union man. Go, go, go. Yes.
So not specifically going to an area of the book, but kind of addressing Dave Parfit's point from earlier and kind of a larger context of what Kendi talked about. I wonder how much of the backlash and the weapons that the assimilationists and segregationists use up to this day hinge on the whole concept that seems to be weirdly endemic for a culture of character, of like there being this abstract thing that each person has that is the essence of them. It's a personal bugaboo of mine. I don't believe in the concept of good people or bad people, or it's good actions, bad actions, and the same people are doing the same thing. And so many people have this weird, to me, notion that people have a character. And I mean, people can have a history of doing bad or good things that can lead you to make judgments about them. But I think that's where a lot of the emotional backlash to stuff like the 1619 Project come in, or the backlash to Phyllis Wheatley and why the civil rights movement, they had to find people who were somehow perfect to even get through the preconception about the African American character. It all comes down to that notion of not looking at what people are doing, but looking at this preconception of who they are. So when the 1619 Project looks at the real human complexity of someone like Thomas Jefferson, or for that matter, when historians look at the complexity of people like Martin Luther King, there's this immediate backlash of,
but don't forget, I mean, when Dr. King is killed, it's because he's talking economic inequity. He's talking about against the war in Vietnam. He's not the docile, the good model, reverend, citizen African-American. So he had to be eliminated because there is also, there is the good that you can do. And yes, we listen to you. Yes, you can march, on Washington. Yes, we'll change the laws. But coincidentally, at the same time, you create, the war on drugs. The drugs were planted, if you saw 13, in the Black neighborhood. The money that was being made was not the one being made by the Black people in the neighborhood. They just didn't have any other way to make money, some of them. So those are the complications of why is it that you need, as a Marxist, why you need that permanent labor force. Because if you remove the historical materialist way of understanding the history, if you remove that, you're left with nothing. I cannot, without the need for a permanent labor force, I don't understand why, you have the shift and you have, again, the demonization of Blackness. And I'm not sure what could happen if we just did away with what I call the criminal injustice system, and we stopped the money-making prison industrial complex. I mean, what will they have? Again, I believe in reparations. I don't know what shape reparations will take, but if you actually pay attention, I forget what Jefferson's fortune is at that point. He also had a lot of debt because he had very expensive habits. But somehow the money that was made with King Cotton, right? The fortunes that were made in the back-breaking work that was done by someone else who didn't get anything. And not only did not get anything, but whatever they got, they couldn't keep because the white people got too jealous and they just came in and destroyed, human nature. Which version of human nature are we going to use to understand white supremacy or to understand the investment in whiteness? I don't know. I just think we have a lot of work to do. We who are around young people and trying to understand and trying to see. I watch my language all the time because, I really think it's important how we say things and how we describe things. When I describe human beings, I never say slaves. I'll say enslaved Africans from the land that became Angola, because they were human beings, they were playing, they were caught. I teach the Olaudah Equiano's narrative in my Black Humanities class. They will remember that. And Equiano is buying the version that actually Jefferson talks about, that climate explains different complexions, he even cites the name of the one person that Jefferson refers to. So don't forget, Equiano's narrative was published 1789, right? The year of the French Revolution. But everything that comes from his mouth is a product of the Enlightenment, because that's what he believes. He's also very critical. Slavery in the West Indies was very different from slavery that he had in Igbo. He was an Igbo. It was a different form of slavery. So he's criticizing the European. But when he speaks, when he goes on the lecture circuit, to sell the narrative and to work as an abolitionist, It's, you know, he's grateful for the light of Europe and the knowledge and all of that. So yeah, he believes the narrative and he does good with the narrative in many ways, because yeah, slavery does get abolished in a kind of way. More? I can talk until tomorrow.
I know you can, Maria. I saw something that Dr. Medeiros put in the chat. This harkens back to when you were talking about the perfect Black person and having that myth of having to be like the perfect minority. Melanie also said, this is the same critique that immigrants' rights activists make. Immigrants shouldn't have to prove that they are proverbial saints to access rights and freedom. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, Dr. Medeiros, but I thought it was a really interesting point to bring up, so thank you.
To be the model immigrant, yeah. Yeah, and again, I came here, you know, as an immigrant. My husband was training to be a psychiatrist at Hopkins. And my first degree is actually Towson, a master's in secondary ed English. That's what I wanted to be. I finished the master's. I went to Brazil, and then I decided that I didn't want to teach high school. We came to US. Hopkins gave us a green card, and then I went for my PhD. So I have a master's in complete and a PhD in complete. So my husband wanted to be around Brazilians, you know, and because there is always a Brazilian there. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to live in the ghetto. I swear I sounded like that, you know, and then just hang out with Brazilians. I'm going to have only American friends, and I'm not going to have the horrible Brazilian accent. And I succeeded, right? My accent is pretty good. But the point is that I totally assimilated. You know, I just could not be, you know, spotted even as a Brazilian. People would come to me, and even now they'll say, "Are you German?" And I, you know, and I was really happy. But this was before my PhD, before, you know, the Africana studies at College Park, before I actually learned about the world and my place in it. I did not know Brazil was the second largest African country in the world until I came, you know, to College Park, and I started understanding the complexity of it. So yeah, immigrants have to fit in, and the more they assimilate, you know, the more they're able to succeed. It's the price you pay, but you shouldn't have to. You know, you really shouldn't. But I only know now that I didn't have to. There's someone talking? No, there's something else in the chat. Wait.
I've been thinking about this notion that Dave and both Justin brought up about equality and how do we reimagine equality. And I'm thinking about how we bring in the discussion of power into that understanding. Because on page 105, when they're talking about Jefferson and thinking about this whole idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, kind of in the middle of that first full paragraph, it says, for these rich men, freedom was not the power to make choices. Freedom was the power to create choices. And then for Jefferson, power came before freedom. And so I think when we're thinking about equality, even in today, and we think about the current political situation that we're in, it's all about power grabs, right? Holding on to power. So I think when we're thinking about equality, we have to think about the redistribution of power. That's just something
I like that. Because you're right, I'm looking at 105. Did they perceive any reduction in their power to be a reduction in their freedom? For these rich men, as you read, freedom was not the power to make choices. Freedom was the power to create choices. England created the choices, the policies American elites had to abide by, just as planters created choices and policies that workers had to follow. Only power gave Jefferson and other wealthy white colonists freedom from England. For Jefferson, power came before freedom. Indeed, power creates freedom, not the other way around, as the powerless are taught. So yeah, so if you think about it, the way freedom is associated with property, right? And without that wealth, you cannot, you know, really guarantee your place in it. So when they talk about power, they are talking about wealth. And that's why the question of reparations should be brought up every time we try to understand how reframing American history would work, right? If you put slavery at the center, indeed as foundational, and you would see all its ramification, all its complications. Somehow the wealth has to be restored. The wealth that they have not been able to accumulate. Brilliant. I'm going to put one of my stickums on this page, created equal. I know. And the created equal, again, I think it's always important because Kendi does emphasize that. We are different. We are not have to fully assimilate, but you demand to continue to be different, but be equal at the same time. I think this is really important. More, I like when you take me elsewhere in the book.
So building on the notion of power, I think if these men were very afraid that they would lose their power, right? So thinking about what's a better way to be now, I think we need to deal with fear. And usually, at least the way that I think of it, the way that you deal with fear is through love. So you can either have love or you can have fear. And I don't know what the answer is there, but I think that if for today, those who are in power generally want to retain power, right? Whoever it happens to be. And there seems to be this notion that we always have to have a hierarchy. And so I wonder, what would we do, or what could we do to alleviate the fear that allows those who maybe have assimilated themselves into a notion that they are less than, that they actually can be equal to, right? And that also means that those who are assuming that they are greater than don't need to be greater than. But I think there's something in there about, if we want to change culture, we need to deal with the fears that people have.
Fears of losing the power, or are you referring to?
I think fear in general. So if we take the example of, so the Haitians revolted, they didn't have anywhere to go. They couldn't just run away. They were on an island. So they revolted and they pushed out those who were in power, right?
Yes, and they killed, and justifiably so, as many as they could of the French planter class. And they defeated Napoleon's army. 3 armies they defeated. So that was a justified struggle. I don't think they had the war because they didn't have anywhere to go. If you read, from where I stand, Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the revolution, he had read everything coming from the Enlightenment and from the French Revolution, right? If you look at the dates, by 1804, they were free. They had read the Declaration of Rights of Man, Liberté, Fraternité, Égalité. So what Toussaint and everyone who followed was enacting in Saint-Domingue was, at the core of the Enlightenment, the idea that we are free and equal, and we have to create the conditions of our freedom, remove the chains. The chains that the 18th century philosophers refer to were mostly metaphorical chains, right? It's the tyranny that keeps you, it's the divine right of kings, it's the church, it's the idea that unless you have the blood, to guarantee the power, you're never going to ascend to any power. But Haitians believed in the premises of the Enlightenment, of creating the conditions of their freedom. So I think people are terrified, or they were at the time, because of the blood that actually ran, and it was like all over. And of course, Americans like Jefferson were even more than terrified, because in numbers, there were more enslaved. There were more African Americans who were enslaved than there were white people. If you remember the colonies in the beginning, I don't know. I just don't think. Where does the fear come from in in the way you're trying to understand it?
I don't know where their fear came from, but when I'm reading about Jefferson here in a new way, right? So, and from what my history books previously had said. So this is a very different view of Jefferson. He was afraid, and that was my only point. And in terms of, if we want to figure out what we do today, is how do we make those who are afraid less afraid? That's my.
From
So-
where I said he was afraid to lose all the money that he had made. He was
Exactly.
afraid to
Why-
lose Monticello. He was
Sure.
afraid. I mean, when you get to his deathbed, you know, in the way that it's described, and all he has around him are the people and the descendant of the people that he enslaved. And you know, the way at least the Kendi tells the story, he seems to be, I don't know, at home in his body. He seems to be comfortable with that. So he had a lot of power. He exerted a lot of power. He framed a society that has, again, the American documents, a blueprint for freedom, but it's a fiction that the country has exploited. The United States goes around nation building, right, and getting rid of quote unquote dictators. But as a blueprint, the American documents, I would hold on to that. But unfortunately has never been actualized. Just the money that you need to get a president elected. You know, what kind of democracy are we talking about? What kind of freedom? You know, the state as an engine of the bourgeoisie. It's only that kind of interest that is at stake. I'm sorry, but I cannot separate the Marxist. Even if you look at how in the beginning of America, 1619 is the beginning, there were indentured servants. And the first who arrived were indentured servants. If you watch the documentary, The Terrible Transformation, right? There is one Negro called Anthony who served the term of his indenture, and then he bought land, and his wife and his children were treated like ladies, and he had indentured servants. What happened was the need for more labor. You have the Industrial Revolution in England, so people that the Welsh, the Scots, and the Irish are not coming as indentured servants in the same numbers. They needed that labor force to stay in England. The ones who were here were rebelling because, you know, people were not obeying the terms of indenture. So how do you make indentured servitude racial slavery, one law at a time, which was also something I had no idea until I saw Africans in the America. It was indentured servitude in the beginning. And you serve the terms of indenture, 5 years, you get a plot of land, and you go and mind your own business. But because profit needed to, in the beginning, for the first colonies was tobacco. So again, you have to look at capitalism to explain racial slavery. You need that permanent labor force. So you create racial slavery, and then you have all the scientific racism of the next century to, you know, because Enlightenment philosophers, they were just talking out of their mouth, but then you have, you know, Gobineaus of the world who actually have scientific, quote unquote, experiments, and they get the bones, you know, the crane, the skull, and he would put little pebbles in it and see how many pebbles went into the European skull and how many went into the African and the yellow peoples. And then he decided that the size of the skull had a lot to do with how much their capability for reason. That was the science of the 19th century. Of course, women also had smaller brains, and that's why they shouldn't learn too much. So those are the, again, you create a science to explain or to justify subordination. Why some people should be the rulers and others should follow. It's a scary history. But now we have the history, right? And other historians will go in the archive and we'll, I don't know, put together stories even more interesting. I think historians should be creative writers. Yes.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time, Maria.
Oh, you're going to shut me up. Okay. It's going to be so
Oh my goodness.
lonely. Okay.
Again, we would like to thank you, Maria, for your time and for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. We'd also like
do
to.
we have the dates of the other books already?
I think we do. David, could you put that in the chat? The conversation. Yep, I see the clapping. Yes.
Okay. Okay. No, because that will give me an incentive to continue reading. And then
Yes,
continue the conversation. Okay.
of
Good.
course. Yeah,
All right.
so
Thank you,
The,
Dave.
next
and
part of the
Crystal for
discussion-
organizing it. Huh?
I would say the next part of the discussion actually is going to be run by Stacy Robertson, who just joined us. And Stacy will be presenting on Wednesday at 2:30 on part 3 of Stamp from the Beginning.
Okay, good, because I only teach 12:30 to 2 and then at 4:30. So I'll be there full time. What part? Part 3? Okay, so nobody's doing part 1? Oh, we have to get Caroline Woydat to do part 1. Don't you think, Catherine? We have to make her. Okay, I'll talk to Caroline. Thank you all. You've been wonderful.
all right, thank you very much, Maria, and thank you everyone for coming.
See you soon.
Alrighty.
Bye. Thank you for moderating this madness, Margot.
Of course, Maria. I could think of no better way to spend my afternoon.
Okay, of course not.
Love
Love you.